are we doing a dog pile?
Oh, heck yeah, dog pile?
Heck yeah, dog pal.
And that is my favourite thing about minion builds. Welcome to my guide on a Soulwrest Summon Phantasm build, or at least my take on a Soulwrest Summon Phantasm build. The footage in the background is from random tier 13 to tier 14 maps to showcase that this build can do high tier content. The key part of this build is in the Soulwrest staff, and the key part of that is in that we trigger level 20 Summon Phantasm whenever we consume a corpse, and we do that in two ways. Either through Volatile Dead or through Bone Offering. So that's the basis of our build, but let's go over the specific gear that we need in order to make this build work. So let's get into the gear. Our weapon is obviously the Soulwrest Staff. For our gem links in this staff, none of it needs to be linked, it just needs to be 6-socketed. We use Summon Phantasm support in order to bring the base 10 phantasms with just the staff up to 20 phantasms, and if you can corrupt it to a level 21 summon phantasm support, you can get up to 21 summoned phantasms. For our other links, we go for minion damage, greater multi-proj. For our clear in maps, we can swap that out for slower projectiles for our single target when you're doing big bosses. We use control destruction for more spell damage because a summoned phantasm projectile is classed as a spell and not an attack, so we get the full bonus from control destruction. We use predator support to help us direct our summon phantasms for single target damage, and we also use hypothermia. Now, hypothermia works because we convert our minion damage to 50% lightning and 50% cold with our gloves, Triad's grip. Triad's grip is where we socket Volatile Dead, and we use Volatile Dead for a few reasons. It is one of our main sources of corpse consumption. It is our source of proccing elemental equilibrium, so that the electric and ice damage that our summoned phantasms do a lot more. And we also use it to proc our second curse. In this case, temporal chains, but you can swap this up for whatever you prefer, like enfeeble. The third unique we need is Victario's influence. Now this one again doesn't need to be linked. It just needs to have 6 sockets and it'll act as a 6-link. Now we use this for our increased effect of non-curses, and the auras that we use in order to buff our summon phantasms get a decent boost from using Victario's influence. In this case we are using the Hatred aura, and we are also using Zealotry. We also summon Skitterbots in here. I'm not entirely sure if they get benefit, but we socket them in there nonetheless. The rest of our equipment, we use rares to fill out as much health as we can while getting as much resistance as we can. There's nothing special about the other rares that we have. The only thing that is slightly special is that we have anointed Whispers of Doom on the amulet that we're using so that we can apply both elemental weakness and temporal chains. Now you don't necessarily need that second curse, but I effectively stuffed up and I have an anointed amulet with Whispers of Doom and I wanted to use it. I didn't want to get rid of it, so that one's not entirely necessary. Onwards to our flasks. For a health flask, we use a Seething Divine Life Flask of Staunching for instant recovery and our immunity to bleeding and corrupted blood. We use Rumi's Concoction. Now this is a great benefit as it pushes our block chance to the cap. We use a Quartz Flask of Heat for immunity to freeze and for the all-important phasing. Especially important because this is Ultimatum League and you're constantly surrounded by monsters. You need some way of being able to get out of them if you don't have a movement skill available. We use Quicksilver because we want to run fast. And last, we use a Mana Flask. You don't need a Mana Flask. You can sub this in for another flask, but it just needs to have immunity to curses. We're using a Mana Flask mostly because we're lazy and we didn't replace it with anything else, but we have enough mana recovery just normally that we don't actually need mana. We could use something else instead. So let's get on to the budget of our build. We'll start with our staff. Now the staff itself is only 2 chaos. However, there's a caveat here, being that it's a strength and intelligence staff. Getting 4 blue sockets with 2 green sockets can be rather difficult. and can be rather costly. There's a few methods of doing this. You can use the jeweler's method and just keep reforging the amount of sockets on it so that you can get what you want. That'll cost you a fair amount of jewelers. You can brute force it like I did with chromes. I don't recommend. I got screwed over heavily and it cost me a lot. Or you can try harvest crafts, as some of the harvest crafts can give you the colors that you might need. So while this is only a 2C staff, the cost in socketing and coloring it can be quite a bit. The Mark of Submission ring is a 1 chaos ring. The Triad's crypt currently go for 1 chaos. Now you have to color it yourself, but they're rather easy to color. They won't cost you very much to color. There's a caveat here in that you could not use a Mark of Submission. You could replace that with another rare ring, get some more life, get some more resistances, get some more chaos res. However, if you wanted to do that, you would need a corrupted Triad script with curse on hit LE weakness. Now those currently go for 2 exalts, so the choice there is up to you. Rumi's concoction flask currently goes for about 5 chaos. Depending on the rolls that you want, it might be a little more expensive. The main point here is that you want as much spell damage, as we get plenty of ordinary attack damage block. For our Fortress Covenant jewel, depending on what you want on there, they currently go for about 10 chaos. Now as for our large cluster jewel, ours specifically goes for around 1 exalt. Now it varies a little bit just by definition of being a cluster jewel, but for our specific things on our cluster jewel, it cost us about 1 exalt. For our medium cluster jewels, they both go for around 30 to 45C. As for our rares, the price can vary quite a bit. It really depends on what specifically you're looking for. You might find a certain combination of mods that you need on one part of your gear really jacks the price up a fair amount. So this part is quite variable, and I'll try and include that in the costing and the final costing for the overall build. As for our rares, our helmet went for 20 to 30C. Our boots go for 40C up to about 1x. For our belt, that's again 50 to about 1 exalt. For our ordinary rare ring, that one's only 20 to 30C. And for our amulet, it can be 50 to 1 exalt. Now for the amulet, you want as much dexterity as you can get. So that's what's pushing the price up on our amulet. Otherwise, it would be fairly cheap. Now if you have another way of getting dexterity, if you want to grab it from the skill tree, or maybe your cluster jewels just have more dexterity than mine do, you can probably push that price down a little bit because you're not really looking for the niche high dexterity stuff. So as for the total cost of this build, it sits between the 2 and 6 exalt mark. Now the caveat there is again with socketing your Soulwrest, if you're as unlucky as I am, you're looking at more than 6 exalts. I had to buy more chromes because I brute forced it, and it did not end well for me. I got very unlucky. So my personal cost for this build is over 6 exalts, but it can easily be done for less if you're just not as outlandishly outlucky as I am. One last little thing to add to the budget is that we anointed Whispers of Doom on our amulet. The golden oils currently go for 50 to 60 chaos, so we'll add an exalt for that as well. So let's talk about our offensive capabilities. We have 20 to 21 phantasms, depending on whether or not you have a level 21 or 20 summon phantasm. We use specters, in this case we use Stygian apes and host chieftains in order to get frenzy and power charges, and we also have elemental army and feeding frenzy linked to them to give them even more utility. Now the caveat here being that frenzy and power charges aren't really going to be up all the time. They're not constantly using their ability. They use it far more often because we have it linked to arrogance. However, the other thing is that we're constantly resummoning our summoned phantasms, so we're having to constantly replenish them. They're not always going to have those charges up, but it's still useful nonetheless. We also use Animated Guardian. In this case, we are using an Animated Guardian with Kingmaker, Learcast, Gruthkul's Pelt, and Victario's Flight. Now the Kingmaker is a massive damage boost, something like 20% just on its own. It gives us 50% crit multi to our summoned phantasms. It gives us Culling Strike, which effectively is a 10% more multiplier, because as soon as the enemy is below 10%, they just die. It also gives us Fortify for a little bit of the extra defensive boost to our minions. Learcast gives our minions 15% increased damage. Victario's Flight gives 10% move speed. And Gruthkul's Pout effectively makes our dude invincible, with massive amounts of life and a massive amount of life regeneration. Another part of our damage comes from Elemental Equilibrium. We use Volatile Dead to proc a fire hit, and then our minions are doing lightning and ice, which does not proc Elemental Equilibrium, but they do take the full advantage of it. Our Elemental Weakness Curse is about 39% less elemental resistance. Now that is lessened against bosses, but it's still a decent chunk. And we also use Skitterbots for chill and shock. So when we need to single target down anything, we use Unearth or Desecrate. We use Volatile Dead, that procs our Elemental Equilibrium. It summons all of our Phantasms. We use our Predator to signal our prey, and our minions go to town. So with all of these things active at once, our single target is through the roof, and it's very safe, because once we've got all these things on, we can just run around and dodge and let our minions go to town on whatever it is we're trying to kill. Now if I've set everything in Path of Building up correctly, and I really hope I have, then our single target in Path of Building is currently showing 3.78 million damage per second with everything operational. But that's not including our Animated Guardian. He pushes our damage up more than 20% on his own. So technically our damage is in the 4+ million section. And that's incredible. I find that incredible. I'd give this damage a solid A+. So let's talk about our main defensive mechanics, and our main one is our block chance. We use Glancing Blows to push our block chance up to 75% for attack damage and 74% for spell damage. Now Glancing Blows doubles that, which is what's giving us that 75-74, but it means we only take 65% of the damage. Now, you don't necessarily need to use Glancing Blows. If you're not using Glancing Blows, then your block chance is 62 for attack damage and 37 for spell damage. Now, I'm not entirely sure on the math, but it might actually be worth not using Glancing Blows in this scenario. You might get more defensive capabilities by not using it, but I have decided to use it nonetheless. I haven't done all the math, it might be better just to not have it. Now we get all of our block chance, some from our skill tree, a fair amount from roomies, and a lot from our bone offering. As for the rest of our defenses, it's really just the small things that add up. So we have effectively more than 5k effective health pool, our resistances are capped as they should be, we have currently 23 positive chaos resistance, which is very good. Any chaos res is great against chaos damage, because I believe most of the game is balanced around just not having chaos res, because historically it's been very hard to get access to. We have recovery on block from bone offering. We have 5% health regeneration from our Soulwrest staff as long as we've consumed a corpse recently. And minions in general absorb a lot of damage that we would otherwise have directed straight at us. It also helps that we cast and we run, and then our minions do the damage and we ourselves don't actually have to stand still. So with all of our defenses added together, the build does feel fairly good to map with. We feel like we're usually in control and not dying all the time. Ultimatums get really iffy, especially towards the higher tier when it's just shooting rares out at you left, right and center. Those auras stacking up, your minions take the aggression, but their summon phantasms, they don't take a lot of damage before they go down. So when they do start going down, you start getting the aggression that was directed at them getting directed at you. And because we don't have a massive life pool, we have glancing blows, we take hits, and we don't have a lot of answers for that once they get through our block chance. Now one potential thing is get rid of glancing blows. When we'd get hit, most of the melee attacks wouldn't be doing damage to us because we'd be blocking 62% of them. About a third of the spells wouldn't be hitting us, So maybe that's worth just as much as having Glancing Blows and the not taking damage from 62% of them instead of taking 65% of damage from 75% of the hits. It's probably worth not going Glancing Blows. There are other ways that you can alleviate some of the damage that you take. We have very easy jewel sockets that we can pick up on the skill tree. We can use those for Abyss Jewels, or just any jewel that gives us extra life. We could use a Darkness Enthroned instead of a normal belt, and use Abyss Jewels in there to give us more damage, but also give us more defenses. We could sub out a Mark of Submission ring, get that curse on hit from the Triad Grip corruption that I talked about earlier, and we could use more defenses from that ring. So there are ways to increase our defenses if you find that you're dying a little too much more than you would like to be. Overall, mostly because it's a minion build, I'd give our defensive abilities a solid B in this case. And now onto speed. As we're going through maps, we are using either Unearth or Desecrate to spawn corpses in the centers of enemy packs. We then either use Bone Offering, or we use Volatile Dead with Spell Echo to get 6 to 5, 5 to 6 Summon Phantasms in the center of the enemy pack. With multiple projectiles, they clear the pack and you've already moved on to another pack. When you come across something tougher, or if your minions are just a little too far behind you and you just want a quick get through this pack, you hit Convocation and they immediately teleport to you, and that pack and anything around you is immediately destroyed in a flurry of projectiles. So overall, I'd give speed a fairly good B-. And now onto the playstyle of the build, a purely subjective, something that changes from person to person. For me, it's a very active playstyle, and I do enjoy the active playstyles because it keeps me focused on what I need to be focused on. You are constantly casting spells in this version of the Summon Phantasm, whereas perhaps with Deathwalk, you'd just be walking through packs and your minions would be doing everything. You wouldn't be actively summoning them. However, as we're using Volatile Dead and Bone Offering in order to summon our Summon Phantasms, it's a fairly active playstyle. Once you get to a boss, you can summon a whole bunch of them at once, and you have a few seconds where you can run around and dodge their abilities. Bossing does still feel quite good, because it usually takes them still a little bit to kill the minions, and your minions are still dealing tons of damage. So let's summarize. The gear is quite easy to obtain, it's all fairly cheap. If you're moving into high tier maps, you certainly want some better gear, and you're looking at a few more exalts, as you would expect if you want to get to tier 14 or 16 maps and do some endgame bosses. Our offensive abilities are a solid A+ for the massive amount of damage that we can dish out when everything is up and going. Our defense is a solid B. Our speed is a B-, and the playstyle of the build is a very active minion build, as we're constantly casting spells in order to refresh our minions, apply our debuffs. My goal with this build was just to create a build around the Summon Phantasm effect from the Soulwrest staff, and I'd consider it a complete success. I believe this build could, with some minor adjustments to get some more defensive points, easily take on the end game. The Conquerors, Cyrus, the Guardians, all of that fancy jazz. Hopefully, I've convinced some of you to try out this build, as it is a fairly unique minion build in that you're just using the Summon Phantasms. So hopefully that all goes well. If you do decide to try it, genuinely hope that you have fun as I did with this.